John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. I don't know if we've read that, but I'm going to go ahead and read it anyway. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself. So we get that in the proper context, he used to help himself to what was put into it. I believe he's still doing it. Jesus was watching him. Somebody say, Jesus knows. Jesus said, "Leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." My message for this morning will be when Jesus is in the house. When Jesus is in the house. As we find ourselves in the 5th week of the liturgical season of Lent, we discover that this morning we have received an invitation to a party. This was no ordinary celebration, but this was a very special event because it marks the culmination of the ministry of the Son of God, and it celebrates the last and greatest miracle that he had performed on his way to fulfilling the very purpose of his coming. In the previous chapter, in John 11, we see Jesus raising a man from the dead and thereby proving that he is indeed the Son of God, and foreshadowing his own sacrifice for the sins of mankind. So John, the writer of this gospel, is inviting us to this dinner party that Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, are hosting so that we might be able to share in and experience the thoughts, the feelings, the attitudes, and emotions of those in attendance as they sit in the presence of Almighty God himself, as he prepares himself for his journey in this, the beginning of the week of his passion, to the cross. If we were to envision this party to which we've been invited in our 21st century context, we would hear music playing. And we would hear the clink of glasses toasting the guest of honor. We might see couples dancing and be able to hear the myriad of conversations about what the guests had seen at the tomb of Lazarus that day, and maybe even witness a high five or two as someone exclaimed, "Yeah, man, Jesus did that thing." Surely all 12 of Jesus' disciples were there, and perhaps some of the ones who had partaken of the fishes and the loaves were there, and maybe the man whose hand Jesus had restored, among others. I'm just speculating. I'm not saying that they were really there. Surely there were those in attendance who had not only seen Jesus' power, but also those who had experienced the depth of his love, felt his compassion, and had been overwhelmed by his ability to see not only the good in his creation, but also the bad, and yet not lose his ability to love them with an all-encompassing love. Jesus had a talent that many of us lack, most of us lack. He was able to see when the devil was operating in somebody, and he was able to see when God was operating in somebody, and it never changed his mind about them. He still loved Peter, even though he ran his mouth like he did. Yes, this is Jesus's party. And in a way, it's also Lazarus' party. It hadn't been too long. Well, let me. I'm getting too excited here and getting happy here. Yes, this is Jesus' party. And in a way, it's also Lazarus' party too, because I can imagine that among this crowd, there were quite a few who, although they were now attending Lazarus' party, it hadn't been too long since they'd been at Lazarus' funeral. And yet, lo and behold, the guy who was dead is sitting in the middle of this party. But either way, whether we consider this to be about Jesus or Lazarus or both, we've all been invited to come to the party this Sunday morning so that we can obtain 4 distinct perspectives on how humans sometimes behave in the presence of their Creator. And also so that we can see what should and should not happen when Jesus is in the house. First of all, we see that the Bible tells us that at this party, Martha served. This is the same Martha of whom Luke chapter 8 speaks, and it characterizes her as being distracted with much serving. In other words, earlier on, although Martha understood that serving is a form of worship, she had not yet come to the level of maturity where one realizes that to everything there's a time and a season. There's nothing wrong with serving in itself, but when our serving has taken precedence over our having a relationship with God, then our serving is thrown out of context. Yet here in John 12, Martha seems to have gotten the point that Jesus had made in Luke 8 when he told her that her sister Mary had chosen the good portion, when she chose to simply sit at his feet, because now she's not all frazzled and upset that everybody else was not doing what she was doing. And the one thing that we do when we, like Martha, give more weight to what we do for the Lord than who we are in him, we try to make everybody else be just like us. But the text here, the text here simply states that Martha served. And that tells us that not only has Martha's service become tempered by wisdom and by love, and that is so necessary because quite honestly, in all my years of being in church, I met some people in very high positions who were not very nice. No, not nice at all. And that indicated that to them, doing had become more important than being. But I believe that Martha had grown up a little bit, and so now her service has now become a form of worship. And that's exactly what we want to happen when Jesus is in the house. Everything we do must become worship. Our passage then moves on to Lazarus. And when it says what it says about Lazarus, or what it says about Lazarus, is that Lazarus reclined. Modern terminology, he was chilling. Now, I'm sure that we can understand that better when we realize that there are no chairs in the house, right, Dee? There are no chairs in the house because in ancient times, guests would eat at low tables and recline on pillows furnished by the host. But let's not allow Lazarus' physical position to cause us to be misinformed, because when we take what the passage says at face value, it looks like Lazarus is just kind of cooling his heels, just kind of kicking back. But I submit to you on today that he too, like his sister Martha, is worshiping. Now, in order to see the situation in its proper context, we have to remember that it wasn't too long since Lazarus was dead. And if there's anything we need after a traumatic experience, it's getting into the presence of the Lord and not necessarily doing anything, but just resting. And it's in that rest that we find restoration. We experience repair. I remember years ago when I first returned to Rochester after living overseas for 14 years, having had to leave 2 beautiful babies behind, having gone from having a job and a wife and 2 children and a family to living in my brother's basement with nothing and nobody and having to start all over again and being culture shocked by moving back to my own hometown, which had drastically changed after living on the other side of the world for so long. And the one tool that God gave me to get through those times was worship. Now, those were some dark days, but they were also some of the most anointed days of my life. Just staying in the presence of God and singing to him at the bus stop and walking in the snow with an empty stomach saying, Lord, I know it ain't always going to be like this, while living in empty apartments and sleeping on the floor and sometimes having no food. And when I went to church and when I led worship at one of the major African American churches here in Rochester, the place would blow up when I sang because what I was doing at church, I was doing at home. And Jesus told us that what we do in secret, he would reward openly. And it was what Lazarus was doing in this passage, where it looks like he was doing nothing, that brought me through those times and blessed a whole lot of people. Fellowship, practicing the presence of God. I know this might not be everybody's conviction, but I believe that we should not get so caught up in our church work like Martha once did, that we lose our ability to just sit still in his presence. Go home sometimes and do nothing. Turn off the distractions and just be with him. Those days of unrestrained worship were some dark days. But now, even though I've got more stuff than I know what to do with, I got a car to drive and food in the icebox and a good wife who loves me and the love and respect of my children that I had to leave in Germany all those years ago, sometimes I miss those days of doing just what we see Lazarus doing in John 10, resting, restoring, recovering, reviving, because Jesus is in the house. Now let's turn our attention to Jesus' sister Mary, and I'm almost done. Remember, there's a party going on, and the place is bumping and the house is jumping when all of a sudden little Mary walks in and does something totally out of character for what we feel is appropriate behavior in a social gathering. But before I address what Mary did, I want us to first look at why Mary did what she did. The passage in verse 3 begins with the word therefore, which I perceive to mean because of. Verse 2b states that Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. So let's read it this way. Because of the fact that Lazarus was sitting at the table with Jesus, Mary did thus and so. Because Lazarus was sitting at the table with Jesus, Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now we already know that Mary loved Jesus. Mary was the one who sat at Jesus' feet in Luke 10 while Martha was having a fit about church work. She sat at his feet and she heard his word, and probably while some of the other disciples were arguing about who was going to sit on Jesus' left hand and who was going to sit on Jesus' right hand when he came into his kingdom, she loved Jesus and she loved his word. But right here, the book says that she did what she did because her brother, who had once been dead, was now alive and sitting at the table next to him. In other words, she did what she did out of love and gratitude for what Jesus had done for her family. And so she made a sacrifice. She gave, and her giving was another form of worship, because when she gave something very, very costly. This ointment called nard or spikenard was made in India and it was transported to the Middle East, and that made it very, very expensive. So we can imagine that this was probably the most expensive thing she had. And she poured it out on Jesus. And not only that, she unpinned her hair, something that an ancient woman would only do in the presence of her husband. And she wiped his feet with her hair, and she was not ashamed. Let me submit to you this morning that there are times when your worship, if you really love God, there are times when your worship is going to look crazy. Worship is not always dignified. If you don't believe me, ask David. David danced in the presence of God, and all his wife could do was go on about how he didn't look like a king. And here she'd never been so embarrassed in all her life. And what were her friends going to think? And David said to her, woman, this is not even about you. It's all about him. And if you make me mad, I'll do worse. We have to understand that true worship is extravagant. It's unrestrained, and it's not ashamed, and it can get loud at times. Yes, it's okay to be loud. God is not going to get mad if we get a little loud in here sometimes. Because if you're the type of person who can't seem to reach God, it may be because you're just a little too worried about what the person next to you is thinking about you, or how you may look to the other people in the room. But there's an old song that we used to sing that says, forget about yourself. Concentrate on him and worship him. And on that note, while I have the floor, and I know Pastor Eric is not going to mind, I just want to tell y'all, it's okay to clap. I've been wanting to get that with him. Susha. As a matter, it's all right to clap. Just do it on 2 and 4. We ought to have a clapping seminar. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. Come on, everybody. 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. Is somebody gonna assassinate me on my way to the car? As a matter of fact, God likes it when we clap. Clap your hands, all people. Shout to God with loud, somebody say loud, songs of joy. Psalm 47 verse 1. See, God says it's all right to clap. It's all right to be loud. And by the same token, it was all right for Mary to do what she did. And when she did, the whole house was permeated with the smell of the perfume. And that tells us that our worship, in whatever form, is supposed to give off a smell. It's supposed to smell like who we've been around. It's supposed to smell like Jesus. There's a lot of skilled church musicians in this city, but when they play, do we smell anything? There are preachers who can preach the paint off the walls, but when they preach, do we smell anything? In Luke's account of this story, we read how a woman poured a bottle, a flask, or a box of ointment over Jesus' head. But before she could pour the ointment, she had to break the box or the bottle, which I understand was very, very decorative. In other words, it was pretty. And in church, sometimes we're more concerned with how things look than how they are. And it's all right to be pretty, but are you broken? Fine to be educated, but are we broken? It's good to be skilled at certain things, but are we broken? Because that's the only time that we can show the world that we've been with Jesus and that Jesus has been in the house is when we're broken. And that's why I had to go through all of the pain and poverty and loneliness 25 years ago, because I had to be broken. When unsaved people come into our assemblies, they're not looking for a show. They're sniffing for a smell. Because when Mary wiped Jesus' feet with her hair, she began to smell like the ointment that she had put on him. She smelled like he smelled. She smelled like Jesus. And when Jesus is here, when Jesus is in the house, the whole house smells like Jesus. And I'm almost done. I said that before, didn't I? Yeah. But even in a house that smells like Jesus, there's inevitably going to be a fly, so to speak, in the ointment. One thing that I've noticed about unbroken people is that they don't like worship. It irritates them. David's wife didn't like his worship because she had her daddy King Saul's mindset and his attitude. Saul was more concerned with how things looked than how they were and what people thought about him, and his daughter was the same way. And so the Bible tells us that Judas, our fly, complained. This is the one thing that is not supposed to happen when Jesus is in the house. Neither is stealing and neither is deceit, but Judas was doing all three. But Jesus didn't even pay attention to what Judas and some others were saying. He was not going to allow the devil to take the spotlight on this day. At this, the beginning of Jesus' journey to the cross, which we commemorate today on this 5th Sunday of Lent, Jesus commends Mary's action because her act of worship, her sacrifice, was an object lesson that demonstrated to all in attendance that she, if no one else did, fully understood who Jesus was, the Son of God, and what it was that he was about to do. not only sacrifice himself for man's sins, but to rise again 3 days later with all power in his hand. And it is this understanding, aside from our service, aside from our fellowship, aside from our giving, that comes into fruition when we boldly and unashamedly worship God. We begin to understand the reality of who he is. That song, Yeshua, don't it take you in? And if we stay there long enough, we begin to learn more about who he is and about who we are. That's why we can't always be in a hurry. When we boldly and unashamedly worship God, we begin to understand the reality of who he is before us and who we are in him. And that's what Paul talks about in Ephesians when he talks about the eyes of our understanding being enlightened. And why through all that very same book, he keeps uttering the phrase over and over, don't you know? Don't you know? Don't you know? Martha knew. Lazarus knew because he had experienced it firsthand. Mary knew. Judas, unfortunately, didn't know, and so his end was unfortunate as well as tragic. But that knowing is the bedrock of our faith, that no matter what comes into our lives to shake us, that truly we are no longer slaves to fear, whether it's fear of eternal damnation or fear of how others may feel about our worship. We are children of God. And it's that knowing that makes our standing in him sure, and that lets us know that no matter what the world is currently saying, our faith is sure and strong because Jesus is in the house. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.